If you have iron deficiency, which now 20% of women around the world have iron deficiency, you don't just have a blood problem, you have a brain problem. Can't make neurotransmitters without iron. Really, every nutrient is essential. The micronutrients, the vitamins and minerals, every single one. The macronutrients are fat and protein and carbohydrate. You don't need any carbohydrate. If you don't have enough cholesterol in your brain, you have a serious problem. If you haven't tried a ketogenic diet, then you don't know yet what may be possible for you. Brain health is about a lot of other things besides nutrition, but you can't have a healthy brain without good nutrition. So it's absolutely crucial. And in my experience, most people, if they're adhering to the recommendations, most people respond within 6 weeks or less. And so some people respond in as quickly as 3 days.
Welcome. I'm very happy. I've got someone I consider a friend and just a wonderful, just great person in general, but Dr. Georgia Ede joining us from Massachusetts, I think. Somewhere. Where are you located these days?
Yes, Massachusetts.
All right. How are things? Is it winter there? Have you guys had much of a winter or is it pretty mild?
Funny you should ask. The other day we got 15 inches of snow, our first snowstorm of the year, and it's almost all gone now. It is torrential rain and wind, and it's balmy and warm out, so I don't know what's happening.
Yeah, we've had a very mild. I'm up in Washington State, just outside of Seattle right now, and it's been very mild. I think this weekend we may get a little bit of snow, and then it looks like it warms up after that. So that may be our entire winter, because usually by February things are starting to go on the warm side. So we may get lucky this year. And I don't mind the snow, but I live on a hill, on a really steep, windy hill, and it's bad. And it's not, the city doesn't plow it. And so it's like when it snows, it's really dangerous getting in and out of my house. So anyway, I don't want to talk about the weather too much. I do want to talk about this book, Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind. And I know you've been talking about this stuff for, a long time, probably a decade or more. What inspired you to write a book? What's the story on that?
I felt like it was involuntary. I feel like it wasn't my choice. It demanded to be written, and I really have wanted to write a book about these topics for, as you were saying, for more than 10 years. And I'm actually glad I didn't write it 10 years ago, because I've learned so much more than I knew. I'm all learning all the time. We both are, right? So I'm glad that it took me this long to create it, because I think what I was able to do is a little broader in scope than what I would have done if I tried to do this 10 years ago. So I hope that people find it useful. I put as much information in it as I could.
And I will, like I said, I have not read the whole book, but I've been reading selected little portions of it, and it is very much, there's a lot of information in there about nutrition and how the body works and how the mind works. And I think it'll be an excellent resource for anybody who wants to look at it, and a good book. And I can tell that you wrote it. You can tell it's very conversational, and the way you give presentations is very fun and pleasant, and it comes across in the writing. So kudos for you for that, for making it still accessible.
Thanks,
that sometimes is a problem with these challenging scientific topics, is it's not very accessible to a lot of people unless they have a lot of training and you help to put it in terms I think most people will be able to understand. Because this was a really controversial topic a few years ago. I think finally we're coming around to more and more people realizing that, yes, indeed, what we put in our mouth does indeed affect our mind. But for a long time, and still today, there's some people say that's nonsense. It has nothing to do with that. And when you encounter people that say that depression has nothing to do with nutrition, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? What do you say when you hear things like that?
Where does the brain come from? The brain didn't materialize out of thin air. It came from the foods you eat. Every single molecule of everything inside your skull and the rest of your body, of course, too, comes from food. And so it matters. Your brain cares a great deal about what you eat. From the very beginning of your life, when you are just a single cell, all the way until the end of your life, it matters every single day.
Yeah. And I did read, that was one of the things I was reading about, the different, fatty acid compositions of the brain. And you talk about that. I had some of this information I hadn't heard all of it. Of course, you were always learning, and thank you for putting that out there. But what are the nutrients that are important for our brain? If you were to say these are the top foods for the brain, for structure, not just function, but for structure, and then maybe there's obviously neurotransmitters and different hormones that impact the brain. What do we need for a brain to be healthy in your view?
We need every essential nutrient, everything. They're all important. Some of them are in larger quantities than others, and some of them are much harder, I think, maybe to your point, Some of them are just much harder to find in modern diets, the way most people are eating now. For example, omega-3 fatty acids, for example, can be hard to find in modern diets. Depending on the ratio of plant to animal foods you're getting, it might be hard to get iron for the brain. A lot of people think of iron as iron deficiency as a blood problem. But if you have iron deficiency, which now an average of 20% of women around the world have iron deficiency, you don't just have a blood problem, you have a brain problem. You can't make neurotransmitters without iron. You can't make energy without iron. And really every nutrient is essential. And then in terms of the micronutrients, the vitamins and minerals, every single one. But the macronutrients, the only one you don't need, macronutrients are fat and protein and carbohydrate. You don't need any carbohydrate. Because your body can make that itself. You do need fat, especially the omega-3 fatty acids, EPA and DHA, which plants do not contain. And you also need arachidonic acid, omega-6 fatty acid, which plants do not contain. That's another element of the brain, which I think a lot of people don't realize, is how hard it is to get there are certain nutrients that are really very difficult, if not impossible, to obtain from plant foods that the brain absolutely requires, and in larger quantities than the rest of the body.
You'd mentioned energy production out of iron. Because obviously iron deficiency anemia is very common, probably the most common deficiency state in the world. We see particular places like India, where there's so many people that are such low meat consumption. It's pretty high incidence there. What does an iron deficient brain look like clinically? Can you say this is a syndrome of low iron deficiency, and what it does in the brain? How does it show up?
It can show up as cognitive difficulty concentrating, especially. And so, for example, the information that we have that is most closely tied, the information that gives us the strongest evidence behind iron deficiency causing problems for the brain, is in the development of the brain. Iron deficiency is a very common cause of intellectual disabilities in children. And so there's a very clear effect on IQ in children who are iron deficient. As you get older, it becomes a little bit more difficult to tell what's going on, because it's just harder. It's harder to make to turn correlation into causation, so to speak. But it's very obvious that in the early stage of life, if you don't have enough iron early in life, it can have lifelong consequences for your intellectual.
No doubt. In the neonatal brain, in the fetal brain, in the early infant brain, that's where so much growth is occurring. And unfortunately, because there's iron in breast milk, and it's interesting. I saw a recent study looking at breastfed babies, and by 14 weeks, their total cholesterol was like 205 on average. It's as high as 250. And so talk about a little bit about cholesterol, because our brain, you mentioned in the book that 20% of the brain in our body is utilized for brain structure, where it's only 2% of our size. And of course, we can't get cholesterol in our diet unless it comes from animal products. Of course, our liver can synthesize it. The critics will say our liver makes cholesterol too. But maybe talk about the utility, is cholesterol a problem for us? And do you see any benefit to having cholesterol in the diet?
Yeah. So first of all, I saw your post on social media about prescribing statin medications, cholesterol lowering statin medications to babies, stat. And I thought that was really
obviously
amusing.
I was being facetious about that, but
I really enjoyed it. So, right. So the brain is very rich in cholesterol, but not a single molecule of that cholesterol comes from the food you eat. None of it comes from your bloodstream, because cholesterol is too big and bulky to cross the blood-brain barrier. So the brain, even though it's extremely rich in cholesterol, makes every single molecule of that cholesterol itself on site from scratch. And what I like to say is, why would the brain go out of its way to make something that's bad for you? It wouldn't. It's really smart. It's a brain. So it flies in the face of biology and logic to think that this is a molecule that's dangerous to us. And the brain needs that cholesterol. The reason it needs so much cholesterol is because every cell membrane is packed with cholesterol for structure and functional purposes. And the brain is loaded with membranes. So myelin, the insulating material that goes around all the circuitry in your brain, is just just multi-layered membranes wrapped very tightly, coiled very tightly around these nerve fibers. And that's just lots and lots of membranes tightly packed. And every single one of those membranes is loaded with cholesterol. If you don't have enough cholesterol in your brain, you have a serious problem.
So a couple of questions that spring to mind from that, because we have peripheral neurons that are outside of our brain. They are the radial nerve running down to my wrist, starts up in my neck and goes down. Is that also protected by a barrier like the brain is, or is it now open to the circulation in a different way? Is there like a peripheral neuron blood barrier? And then the other question would be, or maybe, I don't know if you know the answer to that question. And the other question is the building blocks to build cholesterol. What is the brain using as raw materials to make the cholesterol in the brain? Because it's coming from cholesterol has as you mentioned, three houses and three rooms in a bathroom house type of thing.
3 rooms and a bath.
Yeah. So, do you know those answers maybe?
I've never thought about whether there's a sort of equivalent of a blood-brain barrier in the peripheral nervous system. I will be fascinated to discover that, unless you happen to already know and you can tell me. I don't think so, but I'm not sure, so I don't want to guess at that. So the blood-brain barrier is that I know a lot about, but it's never occurred to me to ask about what the barrier is like outside the brain. So that's a great
because
question.
we see a lot of like things like MS and obviously peripheral neuropathy and things like that. And I've seen in animal studies where, like particularly MS, unless they have exogenous cholesterol in their diet, they don't remyelinate as well, or they can't remyelinate. So it's interesting. So maybe there is a role for dietary cholesterol and perhaps in the peripheral nervous system.
That is really interesting. And I know that there's myelin in the peripheral nervous system. I just don't know if there's that special blood-brain barrier. But you can make cholesterol out of anything. It's just carbohydrate. And it's just carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, right? So you don't need nitrogen or any other special molecules, but it is really complicated to build it. And for all we know, the brain and the rest of the body might prefer to get it from the diet rather than having to make it from scratch all the time, because it's a very complicated process that involves 30 steps. And so the body does absorb cholesterol when it needs it from the diet and may prefer to, and it may, as you're saying, there's a possibility that if we don't eat enough cholesterol, we will not be optimally myelinated and optimally cholesterolized, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you were part of a study a while back, maybe 2 years ago, where there wasn't some inpatient patients with acute psychiatric patients with major depressive disorder or schizophrenia, and I can't remember the other one, and you guys put them on ketogenic diets, and they generally, some of them went in remission, pretty much all of them saw their symptoms resolve. There's this whole sort of metabolic psychiatry field that is now starting to blossom, which you obviously are one of the early pioneers or relatively early pioneers in that. What is going on? How can we use nutrition to treat these awful diseases that are so ubiquitous and becoming more and more frequent? Is there hope for this? And what are you seeing with that?
There's tremendous amount of hope if people have the right information about how to feed the brain properly. I think that a lot of these conditions could be perhaps even prevented, or at least managed better without less medication, or even without medication in some cases. We now know this is possible. So yes, this was a study. The work was done by my friend, colleague, Dr. Albert Janat. He's a psychiatrist practicing in Toulouse, France. Been practicing psychiatry for 35 years and has seen patients. Some of these patients that were in this study, he'd known for 30 years or more. And so what he did was he took invited 31 of his most treatment-resistant patients with chronic, severe mental illnesses, as you were saying, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and severe major depression, who had not been responding to psychotherapy and medications. These patients were taking on an average of 5 psychiatric medications, which actually isn't all that uncommon in serious mental illness, treatment of serious mental illness. And he invited them to come into the hospital as volunteers to try a ketogenic diet under his supervision in the hospital. And so 31 people agreed to do this. And as you were saying, so 28 of them were able to stay on the diet for long enough to be followed for the study, 2 weeks or more. And so 28 of them were able to do that. And all 28 of them improved. All 28, not just improved substantially, 7 to 10 times more, a greater effect than what medication studies show, 7 to 10 times greater effect. And 44% of them achieved clinical remission. And these were patients who had been hospitalized before by this very same doctor, even in this very same hospital, and had never had remission. So this is the remarkable thing about what he demonstrated was that it didn't matter what their diagnosis was. It didn't matter how long these people had been in treatment for an average of 10 years already. It didn't matter how many medicines they were taking or what types of medications. Regardless of that, every single one of them improved to a greater extent than they had before. And it was just a simple whole foods, very mildly ketogenic diet. This was not a strict kind of epilepsy level or brain cancer level ketogenic diet. This was very doable and people tolerated it well. And quite a few of these folks decided to stay on the diet even after they left the hospital. So this was, I think gives people hope. I think it should give people hope that if you haven't tried a ketogenic diet or certain other specific dietary changes I think are worth making, then you don't know yet what may be possible for you.
Yeah, it's one of the things, obviously, George, I've been promoting a carnivore diet now for quite some time now. One of the things that struck me early on was a number of people that were saying that they felt better mentally. Either cognitively they felt clear or their mood was stabilized. Why do you think that particular thing, the last thing, the mood stability, is that tied to glucose surges, or what do you think is causing that, or why is it getting better in that? Do we know?
Yeah, so there are a lot of different mechanisms going on. There are a lot of different reasons why the brain would be expected to do better on something like a carnivore diet or even an omnivorous ketogenic diet. And as you mentioned, one of these is glucose stability, right? So if you're eating a regular diet that's got a lot of ups and downs in glucose and a lot of ups and downs in insulin, two problems with that. So one is that every time you get a spike in your bloodstream, you also get a glucose spike in your brain. And the brain does not tolerate glucose spikes well. In fact, the blood-brain barrier keeps the brain's glucose level about 80% lower than the bloodstream's glucose level. There's not a lot of wiggle room there because the brain doesn't have the same capacity to deal with a lot of extra inflammation and oxidative stress that can come with burning with high levels of glucose. So it's very carefully regulated. So if you get brain's glucose spikes 3, 4, 5, 6 times a day, that's very destabilizing to the brain. That's going to cause a lot of inflammation and oxidative stress, and it's going to cause the extra glucose can literally stick to proteins and fats and DNA molecules and turn them into these kind of sticky, dysfunctional, caramelized molecules called advanced glycation end products, and these trigger an inflammation and oxidative response by the brain's immune system. And so that's a lot of problems right there. The other problem, well, two other problems. One is that every time your glucose is going up and down, your insulin is following suit. And insulin's, one of its jobs is to bring the glucose back down to normal. And you might think, well, okay, what's wrong with that? As long as it comes back down to normal, who cares? But insulin is not just a blood sugar regulator. It's a master growth hormone. And so it is communicating with and controlling, influencing so many other hormones in the brain and body, including stress hormones and reproductive hormones, blood pressure regulating hormones. So every time you're on this roller coaster of not just glucose and insulin, lots of hormones, your appetite hormones are all on a roller coaster all day long and well into the night. That's very destabilizing. And the third problem is that, so then you've got these hormonal issues, stress hormones going up and down. You can get panic symptoms, really strong appetite signals in the middle of the day, even when you've just eaten a couple of hours ago. And the other piece is the insulin that high end, that those repeated insulin spikes are damaging the brain's ability over time to absorb insulin. And so you'll still have plenty of glucose coming into the brain, but over time, if you have insulin resistance, it'll be the insulin that has a harder and harder time getting in. And the brain can't use glucose to full effect, efficiently, properly, to full capacity without adequate insulin. So now you've got an energy deficit on top of this instability and all this inflammation and oxidative stress and high glutamate levels, just everything. There are just alarm bells going off all day long for people who are eating like this. And no wonder people don't feel well. Most people now are struggling with a mental health issue. And is it any wonder?
Yeah. What is the incidence? Do you know the incidence of mental health disorders in the United States now? I think it's like 1 in 4 or something. It's quite a huge number. What do you know what it is currently?
You're exactly right. So it's 1 in 4 adults, and among young adults from 18 to 25, between 18 and 25, it's 1 in 3. So it's rising.
What did you say it was in kids?
In people 18 to 25, it's 1 in 3.
1 in 3. Wow, that's amazing.
1 in 3.
And these are most of them. Most of those are clinically diagnosed. So there's probably people with subclinical stuff that hasn't even come to attention yet. So the true incidence is probably perhaps even higher. My goodness. No wonder everybody's all upset all the time.
That's right. No, if you yourself, listeners out there, if you yourself aren't suffering with a mental health issue yourself, then you know somebody who is, and you're very close to somebody who is. It's just everybody is very close to somebody who is touched by these conditions. And like you said, these are the diagnosable meeting clinical criteria for disorder is 1 in 3, but that doesn't even count all the people who have this lower level depression or brain fog or just joylessness or irritability or not able to get anything done or just getting along. They're getting by. They're functioning, but they're not well.
Do you think this incidence is merely a consequence of better widening the diagnostic net, so to speak, or better diagnostic tools? Do you think it's a true 100 years ago, we didn't have as many depressed people, and now we really do? Or is it just we're diagnosing more? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's both. And so I think we are, and I think this is a good thing. People are coming forward more. There's less stigma. So there are more people to count. But I think we're also getting better at looking for people and counting them. And then I also think it's on the rise. And I can say that there's a lot of statistics that I could pull up for you, but I know this in my bones to be the case because I worked in college mental health for 13 years. 7 years at Harvard, and then I guess maybe, 7 or 8. And anyway, 13 years total. And at Harvard, everybody who'd been there, some people who'd been there for many years, my fellow clinicians, some of them had been here for several decades. Everybody noticed that the students that were coming onto campus were arriving less and less capable, emotionally capable and fit to conduct business as a student, to learn, to tolerate stress, to deal with other people and lots of problems. And then even in the course of my 13 years, I saw it get worse every year. The students who were arriving on campus were less, and some of them were coming on campus. They're already taking 2 or 3 psychiatric medications at the age of 18 and needing lots of specialized support to get through the semester. And working in a college mental health service these days is like running a crisis unit. It's tragic. These are the people who should be in the prime of their lives.
Yeah, it's particularly disturbing because if you look at some of the entrance criteria for Harvard, it's usually someone who has to be very well rounded and have all these extracurricular activities, which would make you seem to indicate that they're people that can interact, and yet even among that group, you find a high incidence of people that are functionally struggling. And I can imagine if you looked at maybe anywhere else, the numbers may even be quite higher. It's quite scary to think about that. What do you think if the incidence has gone up, which I'm pretty convinced they have as well, the true incidence? What do you think is the major driver to that? I know there's a lot. I mean, this is a tough question, but let's just maybe from the nutritional side, because there's probably people say it's video games and staring at lack of socialization through staring at your phone all day and all that stuff. But what do you think nutritionally is perhaps part of the cause?
Yeah, it's true. It's not just diet. Of course, there are other factors. Always, brain health is about a lot of other things besides nutrition, but you can't have a healthy brain without good nutrition. So it's absolutely crucial, right? You can, in some cases, play video games all day and still not have a diagnosable mental health disorder. It depends on who you are. But you cannot have a healthy brain unless you're eating properly. So you need to have, so in any case, the things that the components of the diet, which I think are most damaging to the brain and might help to explain the sort of parallel rise in general metabolic health problems and general physical health problems and mental health problems, which you see they're both skyrocketing and they go off in hand. And if you have, for example, a mental health disorder, you are like more than 3.5 times more likely to have insulin resistance. It's just a very strong risk factor. And there are now some studies coming out that show that if you have insulin resistance and you reverse it with a medication, that this has been shown in a wonderful study in Nova Scotia by Dr. Cynthia Calkin at Dalhousie University. If you reverse insulin resistance with a medication, you can reverse bipolar depression in every case. And that I think the insulin resistance component of the diet, there's a lot of emerging evidence for that. If you've got insulin resistance, your brain will not function properly. And it's going to play a major role in, if not the development of the disorder in the first place, at least the severity and the course of the condition. So insulin resistance is one piece of it, and that's a lot. We could hypothesize all day about what causes insulin resistance, whether it's only about refined carbohydrates and so forth. But I think eating too many of the wrong carbohydrates too often and really overwhelming, kind of pummeling your really delicate insulin signaling system is not good for any organ in the body. And then there are all of these ingredients that have been added to modern foods. Vegetable oils, which cause a lot of oxidative stress in the brain and the rest of the body. All of these mysterious ingredients that come out of factories. We have no idea how most of these affect us. And then, of course, a lot of the things that we're eating less of that we need more of. We're going in the wrong direction when it comes to what the diet should be composed of. So there are things in the diet that shouldn't be there. And then there aren't enough of the things that do need to be there.
Let me ask, because you said something that's very controversial. Vegetable oils are leading to oxidative damage in the brain, because there's a lot of people out there that says, no, these are completely inert fine ingredients. There's nothing wrong with them. Only if you overconsume them calorically are they a problem. What evidence do you point to that shows that there is actual increasing oxidative stress with, say, a vegetable oil versus, say, an animal like butter or something like that, a more commonly saturated fat-rich food?
Sure. So I really wanted to get to the bottom of this question for the book because it is controversial and the science is very new. So this is a brand new area of exploration for scientists, is vegetable oil science. And when it comes to the rest of the body, the science is more advanced than it is for the brain. But the early research coming out of looking at linoleic acid in particular, which is the very fragile omega-6 fatty acid that's so exceedingly high in vegetable oils and a lot of the vegetable oils, that linoleic acid, the early studies have shown the brain absorbs that linoleic acid just as well as it does any other polyunsaturated fatty acid. So it does get across, but then it really doesn't seem to know what to do with it. We're told that we're supposed to eat vegetable oil and linoleic acid. We're supposed to have some of this in our diet, that we're told it's essential in order to make arachidonic acid, a different omega-6 fatty acid, that the brain is actually very rich in arachidonic acid and requires it as part of its, for doing lots of things, including fighting inflammation and promoting inflammation too. It's a complicated molecule. But in any case, that's not what happens to the linoleic acid that we eat. The brain doesn't turn it into arachidonic acid. Mostly what it does with it is it burns it for energy, which is not what you want your brain to be doing. The brain should not be burning fatty acids for energy, because when it does that, it creates too much inflammation and oxidative stress. The brain is designed to burn smaller molecules that are easier to break down, glucose and ketones primarily, not these longer molecules, and omega-6 fatty acids are quite long. So now this is early research, but the science was strong enough for me to at least be able to say that in the book, and that when you consume too much linoleic acid, you are going to be promoting oxidative stress in the brain. What that means and whether that can lead to any additional problems is anybody's guess, but we know that oxidative stress is one of the common features across all neuropsychiatric disorders, is excessive oxidative stress in the brain.
Let me ask you to shift gears a little bit. Recently, I think maybe a year ago, maybe it was 2 years now, there was a study looking at SSRIs. And for a long time, these selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors that have been around for, 50 years or something like that, that was considered part of the brain pathophysiology. There was something wrong with our serotonin system. But study came and showed that no, that's probably not what's actually going on. And perhaps we misdiagnosed it. And maybe that's not the reason why some of these drugs may have some level of efficacy. Is this shift that you're seeing happening across the entire field of psychiatry, or is it still considered, are we still thinking, yes, it's a brain imbalance, this so-called brain imbalance theory of neurotransmitters? Is there a palpable shift within the larger, greater psychiatric community?
I think most psychiatrists, the vast majority, are still The SSRIs, the serotonin medications, things like Prozac and Celexa and Lexapro and Zoloft and Paxil, so forth, these still are the cornerstone of treatment for depression and anxiety, for especially for the milder forms, as opposed to the bipolar and psychotic depression and so forth. So these still are the go-to medications. And I've seen I've been prescribing medicines for 25 years, and I have seen SSRIs work. They don't work for most people, but they do work for some people. And so I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. What I do want to say, and agree with these studies and with you very much so, is that these medicines fail most people. And whether there's a serotonin imbalance in the brain or not, because even if there is in some cases a serotonin imbalance in the brain, A, we don't know if that's the main cause of the problem the person may be having. And B, why aren't we asking what's causing that imbalance in the first place? So, because most people don't do well with these medications, and in fact, some people get much worse on these medications. And in a lot of cases, these medicines will work briefly and then they will stop working, and in some cases even turn against the person. You can't fool yourself into thinking that you can target one chemical in the brain and not have a ripple of consequences on the rest of the brain. The brain doesn't work like that. The entire organ is interconnected. And so you can't change the serotonin level and not have the brain respond and try to rebalance itself in other ways. So can be a backlash.
It's almost as like we're complicated organisms in some way. Let me ask you, because you mentioned that study, that inpatient psychiatric study, I think it was 1 month or something like that. So that's a relatively short period of time, particularly when you're considering some of these people have been in treatment for years and sometimes in cases decades, and then you stick them in an inpatient facility, change their diet, and 30 days later, they're in remission. How long does it take, do you think, and I guess here's the thing, because you mentioned mild cases, because obviously things start mild and they tend to progress and they get worse. I see this with things like, say, ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease. Some little 15-year-old kid gets that. And by the time 10 years have gone by, they're sitting there with half their intestines removed. Can we talk about the efficacy of maybe nutrition in early intervention and then perhaps in late intervention, how it can be efficacious, and how long do you think it might take, or do we know that?
Yeah. So at least in my experience, so I use a variety of different nutritional strategies in my clinical work. And part of that depends on what the person is willing to try. But the cornerstone of my work is really ketogenic and mostly meat and carnivore diets is along that scale. I have a lot of experience with those different types of dietary strategies. And in my experience, most people, if they're adhering to the recommendations consistently enough, most people respond within 6 weeks or less. And I think the majority of those people really, you see a shift. Some people get better in 3 days, but there's kind of a bell curve, if I could say. So some people respond in as quickly as 3 days. Other people, more like 2 or 3 weeks. Week 3 is usually a turning point for a lot of people. And then if by week 6 you haven't seen a lot of improvement, you might need to wait 12 weeks. In some cases a little longer, but I would say most people, it's between week 3 and week 6 that you see really marked shifts, and people will feel it. It's a shift they can feel in their bodies and their minds, and think, this is different. This is a different state of mind. This is different. I feel different.
Yeah, it's interesting that, because a lot of the athletic literature seems to show that a 3-week adaptation time from becoming quote unquote fat adapted for athletic purposes, which makes sense with that same sort of time frame that you're talking.
What have you noticed, Shawn? And what would you say timeline in your clinical experience?
So I surveyed 12,000 people, specifically asking about carnivore diets, and not everybody was 100%, but they were varied 70, 80, 90, 100%, something like that. And what we saw was that by 3 months, the vast majority of people saw significant improvement. Now, a lot of people would say earlier than that, but by 3 months, most of the people that were going to respond have responded at least partially, maybe not fully resolved, but we start seeing some significant shifts across all kinds of different disease states, whether it's mental health or gut health or just inflammatory states in general. So that seems to be ballpark, I think, makes sense. I know there's a lot of physiologic things that are occurring, during that time frame. So as far as you said, you're using ketogenic diets, sometimes carnivore diets, and that, because obviously someone like, oh my gosh, I'm no longer depressed, that's got to be motivating. But because obviously the concern is long-term adherence and what happens if we go off the diet too far off the wagon? Does it recur? Have you seen people with recurrence when because that's really a true test. If you have an intervention and it works and then they stop the intervention and they go back, then that's pretty solid evidence. Do you see that as well sometimes?
All the time. Adhering to these diets can be challenging. And in most cases, what I see, I work with adults, I don't work with children. Children are much more metabolically flexible, a lot less damage. They've had a lot less time to accumulate damage to various systems. And for example, the epilepsy literature has shown that children with epilepsy who respond to a ketogenic diet often only need to be on the diet for a year or two, and then they can go off the diet and they remain seizure-free. So that's fascinating, right? So you think, is that possible in adults? If adults with bipolar disorder or schizophrenia or major depression, other issues, could they get enough healing after a while to be able to go back to eating, normal or abnormal way? And there's only 2 or 3 people out of the hundreds of people I've worked with that I can say were able to relax their diet to a significant extent and not relapse. Almost everybody sees their symptoms come back pretty quickly. And I know this because it's very difficult to stay on these diets long term and not to slip off and not to, like to say, the diet gets interrupted, right? So life happens, the diet gets interrupted, and almost everybody will feel much worse, often within 24, 48 hours.
Yeah, sometimes it serves as a reminder and kind of keeps them on the straight and narrow. Yeah. And so that is of interest. So I got a question for you. I see a lot of people like, I eat a steak, I feel pretty good, I'm pretty happy. Am I imagining of that, or are there happiness nutrients in steak? Can you talk about that at all?
Yes, they're labeled with a little H. I think heme iron is one of them. Yes, the happiness molecule. I actually don't know. And I think if I can just venture a guess, when you're giving your cells everything they need, I think they're going to start smiling and they're going to be very grateful to you for feeding them properly. But in terms of there being a particular ingredient within meat, I think it may be maybe the sum is greater, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. A lot of people have told me, with red meat in particular, and it doesn't have to be mammal meat, it can be duck, for example, which is a red meat. When they're eating a nutrient-dense, a really nutrient-rich animal food, a lot of people say this happens to them with eggs as well, they just feel well, different than they do when they're eating, say, white meat chicken or white fish. I find it fascinating, and I think it makes a lot of sense, but I can't explain it to you biochemically. And maybe, do you have a hypothesis?
No, I do think it's a combination. I think it's just a good food for us. I think we're largely evolutionarily adapted to eating it as a significant source of our calories. And whether you want to go strict carnivore or eat a lot of meat, I think it seems to make it. I like, some people call it a zero carb zen or a carnivore calm or something like that. But it generally seems to result in just chilled out and generally pretty happy. And you don't have the sort of the wild vacillations of mood, and you seem to be a little more stress resilient and that sort of stuff.
Yes.
Is there, because there's different, you mentioned kids being more metabolically flexible, are there any other population differences that, say, a schizophrenic might need this more likely than, say, someone with major depressive disorder? Or have you seen any sort of common dietary requirements that one might need more than the other, perhaps?
I haven't. I think all cells need the same basic nutritional care, regardless of what the diagnosis is. What I have noticed, and I think this is going to come out in the research, we'll understand better as we study it more, is some people seem to need higher levels of ketones than others. And so some people need to be stricter with their macronutrient ratios and other aspects of their lifestyle to really get good healing. And I do see, for example, Dr. Ian Campbell, who's an amazing researcher, PhD researcher at the University of Edinburgh, who put his own bipolar disorder into remission now for 7 years on a ketogenic diet, and now researches ketogenic diets for bipolar disorder. Just a really brilliant researcher. He just published a pilot study where he, in patients with bipolar disorder who were euthymic, meaning they weren't manic or depressed at the time, their mood was relatively in the middle, and just to see if they could follow a ketogenic diet. And he made some measurements along the way and documented some interesting findings. What he noticed was the higher the ketones were, the better people seemed to be in terms of their anxiety levels, their mood, and their energy levels. And I see this in my practice too. There are some people who really need, at least at first, to achieve a particular degree of ketosis in order to recover. And this may have to do with the degree of impairment in their brain's glucose processing capacity. Because the more damage you have to the brain's glucose processing system, the more ketones you're going to need to bridge that energy gap.
Yeah, that's consistent with what I've seen as well. And I think particularly people that come to Carnivore and they're suffering from some sort of central nervous system disorder, whether it's a psychiatric mood disorder type of thing or mental health disorder, or perhaps something like MS, that higher fat seems to be more effective at mitigating their problems. I have a question about the gut, because people talk about the gut-brain axis, and I didn't notice if you talk about it in your book here in there, but I'm sure you have some insight into that. How are we seeing more and more evidence that people with certain gut disorders have higher incidence of X, Y, or Z mental health disorder?
Yeah, there is, if you have IBS, what's called IBS, then you're more likely to have certain mental health conditions and vice versa. And so there is, again, that correlation. Is there causation? We don't know, but there's a strong correlation. A lot of my patients have gut dysfunction. They may not mention it. They may not volunteer that information, but I always ask. And there are very few of my patients over the years who have said, no, everything's completely fine with my gut. And I think there's a lot of talk about the microbiome and that we need to feed the microbiome in order to feed the brain properly and so forth. All that information that people are hearing in headlines and research and the new studies, none of that is ready for prime time yet in terms of helping us understand how to eat to optimize this system. But what I do notice is that a lot of my patients have gut dysfunction, and it's very likely or let's call it plausible. If you have damage to that barrier, that's your first line of defense is your gut. And if it's not working properly to absorb the nutrients you need and to keep out the molecules you don't want that are going to aggravate your immune system and damage membranes and damage your blood-brain barrier, et cetera, overwhelm your detoxifying capacities, then you're going to have a higher chance of having mental health problems. It makes sense that you would, but none of that has been worked out to anybody's satisfaction yet. The science is still emerging.
Yeah, I just look at the fact that we're still debating about the function of cholesterol in a way. And cholesterol has been known about for almost 120 years now. And the microbiome is many orders of magnitude more complex, thousands of species, trillions of organisms changing every 15 to 20 minutes. And with this cholesterol molecule, it's the same molecule. It's never changed. And it's always there. It's more or less. So we still can't figure that out. We're supposed to figure out this thing that's infinitely more complex. You'd mentioned with some of these disorders, there's brain energy, access to brain energy issues. Maybe the brain's not as good at extracting or utilizing glucose due to perhaps insulin resistance. Do we know, is there a positive relationship between some of these mental health disorders, whether it's depression or something else, and the eventual development of these neurocognitive issues like dementia? Is there a pretty strong correlation between depression and dementia?
A very strong correlation. You have a much higher chance of developing. I've written about this in the book, asking this question: are certain forms of depression pre-dementia? And because there is a much higher chance of you going on to develop dementia if you have depression. And a lot of people with depression have it's common to see something called pseudo-dementia, meaning that you have trouble concentrating and remembering things, paying attention when you're depressed. And so a lot of the same mechanisms could be at play, meaning that your brain is not functioning on all cylinders. And that could be a pre-dementia state. Dementia takes decades to develop. It doesn't happen overnight. It's preceded by decades of gradually slowing brain glucose processing. So by the time you notice any cognitive symptoms, there's already been quite a bit of damage. We need to people need to think about prevention rather than waiting until they notice symptoms.
Yes, dementia is just that's a very sad diagnosis, obviously, but it impacts the whole family. And sometimes people can't work anymore because they got to babysit their parent who's going to wander into traffic or something like that. So or they put them in a place that's very expensive. So it's a very expensive problem to have. It's obviously good. What about, so you'd mentioned a ketogenic diet and being in ketosis seems to have this beneficial effect. What about exogenous ketones? Do we have studies on exogenous ketones versus bipolar, depression, or anything? Are any of those things been done? Or is it everything that goes into becoming ketogenic that's more important? Do we have any sort of sense of lay of the land is on that stuff?
Yeah, I expect those studies will be coming out. We do have studies on on MCT oil in particular, and dementia and mild cognitive impairment. I'm not aware of any studies of exogenous ketones for other psychiatric disorders. I can't think of any. But it is people often ask me, why don't you just use exogenous ketones as a test to see whether someone would benefit? If they benefit from exogenous ketones, maybe they'll benefit from a ketogenic diet. And I have tried that in certain folks who can afford them and want to use them. And sometimes it seems to make a difference, a dose of an exogenous ketone supplement. Sometimes it doesn't. And so I'm a big fan of generating the ketones from within for a lot of reasons. The exogenous ketones, while I do use them as a tool sometimes to help people transition to the diet, or in people who can't tighten up their diet enough because of their living situation or what have you, then you can use them as a tool to bolster a mediocre diet or that sort of thing. But the reason why I don't love using a lot of exogenous ketones in my practice is because I really want people to get the full benefit of being in ketosis, which is not just ketones present, but lower insulin levels and lower and stable glucose levels. That doesn't come in a bottle. So the only way you can lower your glucose and insulin levels is through your lifestyle. I guess you could take GLP-1s nowadays, right? But so what you really want is because that's what's causing the problem in the first place. You want low, stable glucose levels. You want lower, smoother insulin patterns. And you want to generate ketones from within 24/7 for free. And exogenous ketones can't do that for you. They're really expensive. The ones that are actually very effective are expensive, and they only work for maximum a couple of hours in the body. So they're not going to be working for you overnight. They're not going to be working for you in between doses, and they're really pricey. So so there are some limitations there, but there are some studies in the cognitive literature that show that they can make a difference. And I have certainly used them in some of my older patients with mild cognitive impairment and early dementia, and they have found them to be useful supplements.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I suspect when we go on a low carb or ketogenic diet that we, as much as creating ketones, we're also removing things that are probably problematic, and you lose some of the benefit if you're just, taking an exogenous ketone. Let me ask you about, because you probably at some point have dealt with addiction, various addictions, whether it's drugs, alcohol, sex, gambling, blah, blah, you name it. People are addicted, just food addiction too. That diet, in my experience, I've seen people that go on this sort of restrictive carnivore-ish diet and they exclude everything. And then all of a sudden they say, I don't really need to smoke anymore. It's an interesting thing. Can you make sense of that? Is there physiology in the brain that would explain that observation?
I've seen that so many times as well. In fact, it was just last week, I saw a gentleman I've been working with for several years now who enjoys gambling and also has a long history of food addiction. And after a long time of trying other approaches, low carbohydrate diets and so forth, and intermittent fasting and all kinds of other approaches, even GLP-1s, decided to give the carnivore diet a try because other things just weren't helping. And he found very interesting. Not only did he say to me that he felt full for the first time in 60 years, but that he didn't have the same pull towards the casinos that he had before. It was really interesting to him. That used to be something that was really fun that he used to enjoy. And so I've heard this a lot. And so in terms of the mechanism, I'm wondering, I can only speculate, of course, but I'm wondering if when you're smoothing out this roller coaster of glucose and insulin and stress hormones, your dopamine's going up and down, your stress hormone, your adrenaline, your cortisol going up and down, everything's going up and down. A lot of people use vices to self-regulate. They use these vices to help them feel a little better momentarily. They will ultimately backfire, but they use them to help try to smooth things out or feel a little better. What if you're already feeling well? Maybe you won't be hunting so much for something to take the edge off, you know what I mean? Or to give yourself a feeling of pleasure. Yeah,
that was one of the things. When I lived in California for a time, and next door to us was a sort of a recovery treatment center for women with drug and alcohol issues. And I guess they're in rehab basically, but they were always eating junk. It was always like pizza and Cokes. Mm-hmm. And I think that's pretty common, probably because it's cheap food. and they just put all these people in drug and alcohol recovery programs, and they just put them on junk food. So I'm sure that diminishes their success rate. It has to, I would imagine. So hopefully,
of course,
we can, because I remember when I did my psychiatry rotation as a medical student, and we'd spend time in the ER, and you would have these so-called frequent flyers. People are in there every week with suicidality, and you'd have to babysit them overnight, and maybe they were just getting a meal or something like that. But I just wonder if we were to put the resources in just feeding those people an appropriate diet, maybe just buy them steaks for 6 months or something like that. It might be cheaper long-term compared to how much resources they're taking up, because every ER visit takes up thousands upon thousands of dollars of resources. And just, do you see where that can be a potential? Is there an appetite for that? That's a little bit of a pun there, but do you see that that's something we could realistically do instead of just here medicate every Haldol? It's like, I remember it was 10 and 2, 10 of Haldol and 2 Ativan. Boom. That'll chill them out, right? That'll chill those guys out, right? But I just give them a steak or something like that. What do you think?
Yeah, I think giving them the right foods or making the right foods available to them, I think could be potentially useful, but you'd also have to remove the wrong foods. Yeah. I don't know how helpful it would be. Just if someone's not getting enough animal protein, animal nutrients, then I think adding the steak could be really helpful. But if you don't also take all the junk out of the diet that's causing that ongoing damage, I think the benefits could be limited. What I'd really love to see is a short-term residential nutrition retreat where if someone is really struggling, especially in today's food environment, and there's so many temptations. And even if they wanted to try a healthier diet, it's very difficult to do on your own, especially if you're living with other people who aren't eating properly, or you don't have a lot of money or a lot of strength at that point because you're not feeling well. To have somewhere you can go a couple of weeks, maybe 2 to 6 weeks, to remove yourself from that really toxic environment and have just really good food and nourish the brain properly. And in an environment where people could look after the medication adjustments, whatever, keep you safe, and educate people about nutrition and give people a break from all that toxicity and support them to eat healthier, and then see if when they leave, maybe they would have a fighting chance.
Yeah, interesting, because there's actually a place that exists just like that. There's a fellow by the name of Hal Cramner who I've interviewed a couple.
Oh, yes,
yeah, yes. He does nursing homes, and he's had patients that were dementia patients that have literally been able to go back to being able to live independently again. And, bariatric patients losing trust, and he puts them on ketogenic, carnivore diets, has them engage in exercise and a few other interventions. And just like you talked about, that's what I'm thinking. If you got somebody that's in the ER every week, if you just, we're going to sit you over here for 6 weeks, feed you good food every day, get you maybe rehabilitated in an appropriate way. But we're too reactionary. And here's the emergency. He's not suicidal now, so we can stick him back out and he'll be back next week. Instead of having that sort of mindset, it's like, let's have a little more comprehensive treatment, which I don't think would cost more, which is the thing. I don't think it costs more than the episodic care does.
I don't think emergency room care is exorbitantly expensive, and it's not effective. Even if for all that money, you're not solving the problem. You're just creating dependence on a broken system.
Yeah, absolutely. Georgia, we're close to out of time, but I want to just change your diet, change your mind. I know it isn't released yet to the public, or is it? I think it comes out at the end of this month, correct?
January 30th. You can pre-order it now, but it's not. It won't come until January 30th.
Okay. I encourage people to read the book. And do you want to just in the last couple of minutes, just give a brief overview of what they're going to find in the book?
Sure. So the book is in 4 parts. And so the first part of the book explains why most of the nutrition headlines and most of the guidelines that we are familiar with in terms of good nutrition are wrong. Really walks people through why they can't trust a certain type of this nutrition epidemiology studies that are questionnaire based, why those are so important to completely ignore. So walks people through that, but then also explains all the problems with modern diets, what is it about the modern diet which is so damaging to the brain? So the first part is about how we got into this mess in the first place. So bad nutrition science, bad food. And then the second part of the book is more about brain chemistry. And so I can just show people So in the first part has a lot about brain metabolism and so forth. The second part is about, processed foods and the hormonal roller coaster that we talked about, insulin resistance, helping people understand the underlying mechanisms of how food affects the brain. And the third part, this is the whole truth about whole foods, is the third part, walks you through each food group. So what are the grains, beans, nuts, and seeds all about? And what are dairy and eggs all about? And what about meat and all of the myths about meat and all the scary things you hear about meat all the time? Fruits and vegetables has its own chapter, etc. There's a chapter about plant-based brains. So what the risks are of plant-based diets for the developing brain and for the adult brain. And then the fourth part of the book is all how to. So how to change your diet, different dietary strategies, including a kind of a lower glycemic paleo diet, a ketogenic diet, and a carnivore diet, variations on those themes that are a little quieter on your immune system and gut and nervous system and thyroid and so forth. There are some foods I've taken out of those standard diets as suggestions for people who are more sensitive.
Yeah. Okay. Wonderful book. And I wish you tremendous success on this. I hope it's a bestseller. I'm sure it will be. And Georgia, thanks for doing all the work you do. And the one thing you mentioned about the red meat, I know you had such a wonderful analysis of the World Health Organization's red meat causing cancer back in, what was it, 2015? I think you wrote the analysis shortly after that. And that to me is very valuable. I don't know if you touch on that in the book at all, but that's because we continue to see even today, red meat causes colon cancer, red meat gives you heart disease, it's going to give you diabetes and make you fat, and which I think is all nonsense, of course. But anyway, thanks for doing that in the past, and thanks for continuing to do what you're doing today, Georgia. Anything else you want to share before we go?
Yeah, so just thank you for saying that. And that is all in the book. Every meat myth is addressed, and the WHO is addressed in detail in the book. So thank you. I'm glad that you and your followers have found that useful. And thank you for the work that you've done to help people get familiar and comfortable with these diets and have the courage to try them and experience a lot of the health benefits. I think it's really, in large part, thanks to you that so many people are becoming more comfortable with these ideas. So I appreciate what you've done.
Yeah, just as an aside, we're in the background right now. There's a number of studies that are going to come out. We're in the process of putting these together, so we'll have even more sort of scientific information. A lot of people don't care about it. They just want to they look at a picture or see somebody else's success story. That's fine for them, but for the science nerds and the physicians, we're getting some science done, which I think is really exciting. So that's awesome. So anyway, thank you, Georgia. I appreciate it, and good luck to you. And I'm sure I look forward to seeing you again in real life again. So take care.
Likewise, you too. Thanks a lot.